We all know winter is the harshest season of the year. Colorado is no exception, but there was a German Shepherd puppy abandoned in the cold weather. A Navy SEAL found it. He didn't care because he was still in pain from the past, but it tried to drag its small body onto his shoes. His defensive shield was broken. What happened next will show you. Saving someone's life is also saving yourself. Before we begin, please let me know where you are watching from. Subscribe to see more. Snow drifted endlessly over the Colorado Rockies, muffling the forest beneath a white shroud. Inside a lonely wooden cabin half buried in snow, a faint orange light trembled from the fireplace. Ethan Cole, 40 years old, a former Navy SEAL K-9 handler, lived there in isolation. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked in gray, and a scar beneath his left eye. His face was lined and quiet, his eyes carrying the kind of stillness that only comes from seeing too much. A slight limp marked his right leg, an old wound from the explosion that had ended his service in Afghanistan. The war had taken his brothers, his dog, and most of his sleep. The cabin breathed with the rhythm of fire and silence. Above the mantel hung a tattered Navy flag and a single dog tag stamped Shadow, K-9 Unit, SEAL Team 3. That name was the ghost that never left him. Ethan spent his nights sharpening his knife by the fire, the metallic scrape echoing in the still air. He didn't talk anymore. There was no one left to hear. Outside, a storm gathered. Wind battered the walls and howled through the trees. Ethan sat unmoving, the knife still in his hand, his gaze fixed on the flames that flickered like the memory of explosions. He thought of Shadow sprinting ahead through the dust, of the blinding flash, of silence afterward. He clenched his jaw. He had learned to hate memories. Then came a sound, faint, brittle, almost swallowed by the wind. A whimper. He frowned, tilting his head toward the door. It came again, soft but desperate. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the storm, but the sound returned, higher this time. A cry. He muttered a curse under his breath, grabbed his parka, flashlight, and gloves, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow lashed against his face, and the world disappeared into white. He stepped forward, flashlight beam slicing through the chaos. Each step sank deep into the snow, his limp slowing him. The cry came again from somewhere near the trees. He followed the sound, teeth gritted against the wind. Half buried beside a fallen pine was a small cardboard box. Ethan knelt, brushing away snow with stiff fingers. Inside lay a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 7 weeks old. Its fur was soaked, dark brown and black, its ribs visible beneath the skin. The tiny paws twitched weakly. Its eyes, pale gray, confused, and clouded with cold, met his for a single moment before lowering again. He looked around. Faint tire tracks curved away from the trees, already filling with snow. Someone had driven up, dumped the box, and left. His jaw tightened. Cowards, he muttered. He should have turned back. The world had already taught him enough about trying to save what was meant to die. But then the puppy lifted its head and made a soft, broken sound. Slowly, painfully, it dragged itself out of the box and across the snow until its nose touched the toe of his boot. Then it stopped, too weak to move again. Ethan froze. The small, shaking creature lay there against his foot, its breath a faint flutter. Something in that gesture, the stubbornness, the quiet plea, broke through the armor around his heart. He crouched, ignoring the protest of his knee, and reached out a gloved hand. "You stubborn little thing," he murmured. "You really want to live." He lifted the puppy, tucking it inside his parka against his chest. It was light, barely more than a handful of bones and cold fur. He could feel the faint heartbeat fluttering against his ribs. "Hang on," he whispered, turning back through the storm. Inside the cabin, he shut the door and knelt by the fire. The puppy lay limp on the blanket, its breaths shallow. Ethan worked with calm precision, the way he had done in the field. He rubbed the pup's sides, careful not to shock its body with sudden heat. He wrapped it in an old wool towel that still smelled faintly of shadow. "Not tonight," he whispered. "You don't die tonight." He warmed water and mixed it with powdered milk, feeding a few drops into the puppy's mouth with the cap of his flask. The small tongue flickered. A breath caught, then another. Ethan exhaled in relief, his hands trembling slightly. He placed the puppy near the fire, turning it gently so the warmth spread evenly across its tiny body. Hours passed. The storm roared outside, but inside, only the soft crackle of the fire and the faint sound of breathing filled the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The towel on the floor rose and fell slowly. He closed his eyes, the sound of the wind fading, and for the first time in years, he slept without the shadow of war pressing down on him. Morning came pale and quiet. Sunlight broke through the frost on the window, spilling faint gold across the floor. Ethan stirred and rubbed his neck. Then he heard it. A small noise, almost a sigh. The puppy was awake, sitting up unsteadily near the fire, watching him with bright, uncertain eyes. He blinked in disbelief, then smiled, something that had almost disappeared from his face. "Well, look who made it," he said softly. The puppy tilted its head, one ear flopped over. Ethan reached out a hand, and the little creature took an unsteady step forward, licking his knuckles. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half breath. "Guess we're both stubborn." He prepared more milk and let the puppy drink, its tail thumping weakly against the blanket. "Scout," he said suddenly, testing the word aloud. "That's your name. You found me first." The puppy gave a faint bark, as if approving the choice. Ethan leaned back, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them both. He looked toward the mantel where Shadow's tag hung. The memory still hurt, but for the first time it didn't hollow him out. It simply reminded him that something lost could still lead to something found. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and life. Outside, the world glistened under new snow. Inside, a man and a puppy rested together, the silence no longer heavy, but whole. And for the first time since the war, Ethan Cole felt that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been left behind after all. The storm had passed, leaving the forest blanketed in an endless sheet of white. The morning light slid across the frozen pines like liquid gold, reaching the small cabin where warmth still lingered from the night before. Ethan Cole stirred awake in his chair, the fire reduced to soft embers. His back ached, and his knee burned with its familiar throb. But when he looked down, the sight waiting for him stopped every thought. The little German shepherd was breathing evenly, no longer trembling. Its fur was still damp, but beneath the towel, a faint rise and fall marked the rhythm of life. Ethan reached forward, his rough hand resting on the small form. "You made it," he murmured. He added more wood to the fire and poured warm water into a small tin bowl. The puppy stirred, its nose twitching at the faint scent of heat. When he set the bowl down, it moved weakly, pushing its head toward the edge. The small tongue flicked once, twice, then began to drink. A quiet determination glimmered in the pup's cloudy eyes, and Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Days folded together like soft echoes. Snow fell again, but gently this time, dusting the trees with silver. Inside the cabin, Ethan built a rhythm. He warmed milk, cleaned the floor, mended the torn jacket he hadn't worn since deployment. The puppy, whom he'd named Scout, grew stronger. It followed him clumsily from chair to chair, its tail wagging too hard for its size. Sometimes it tripped over its own paws, tumbling onto the floor with a small yelp before climbing up again, eyes bright with defiance. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. At night, when the wind groaned through the forest, Scout would curl up near his boots, nose tucked into its tail, and sleep beside the fire. Ethan often woke from nightmares. Flashes of gunfire, the choking smoke of Helmand, the sound of Shadow's final breath. But each time there was a gentle weight near his leg and a steady warmth that brought him back to the present. Scout didn't speak, didn't judge, didn't ask. He simply stayed. After nearly a week, supplies began to run low. Ethan had lived on dried meat and beans since before the storm. His coffee tin was almost empty, and the puppy's milk was down to crumbs. He decided to make the trip into Aspen Ridge, the nearest town, 15 miles down the valley road. It had been nearly 3 months since he'd gone there. He packed carefully, food list, some cash, and a few bullets for his rifle, just in case the trails were blocked by wolves. Scout was still too young to walk that far, so he built a small crate lined with Shadow's old blanket and strapped it behind his snowmobile. The journey took 2 hours. The wind cut sharp through the trees, but the morning sun softened the edges of the world. Scout poked its head through the crate's gap, eyes wide with curiosity, nose twitching at every new scent. For Ethan, the sound of the engine against the silence of snow was oddly comforting. It reminded him of missions past, of focus and direction, but this time his destination was life, not death. Aspen Ridge appeared like a memory carved into the mountain. A few wooden shops huddled near a gas pump that had frozen over, a church steeple caught the light, and an old diner sign blinked half-lit through the frost. When Ethan stopped in front of the general store, the snowmobile's roar broke the town's quiet rhythm. A few heads turned. He wasn't unknown there, just rarely seen. The locals called him the man from the ridge, a veteran who came down once in a while for fuel and disappeared back into the snow. The store's doorbell jingled as he stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of pine soap, coffee, and dry wood. Behind the counter stood Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her 40s, slim but strong-shouldered, with auburn hair tied loosely in a bun and green eyes sharp as river glass. Her face bore the quiet strength of someone who had learned to endure rather than complain. She had lived in Aspen Ridge all her life, running the store since her husband died in an avalanche 5 years ago. The ring he'd given her still hung from a chain around her neck, worn smooth from years of being touched, but never removed. She looked up as Ethan approached, her expression curious but calm. "Well," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth, "you're a rare sight before noon." Her voice was gentle, mountain-worn, carrying the dry humor of someone used to solitude. Ethan set a small list on the counter. "Milk powder, canned meat, a new lamp wick," he said quietly, "and dog food, if you have any." Sarah raised a brow. "Dog food?" Her lips curved faintly. "Didn't think you were the pet type." Ethan hesitated, then nodded toward the crate he'd carried in. Inside, Scout blinked up with sleepy eyes. Found him during the storm. She leaned forward, peering inside. Well, you two found each other then, she said softly. Her hand brushed the puppy's head. Scout licked her fingers. He's a fighter. You'll need goat's milk for his stomach. Canine breeds can't digest the usual stuff when they're this young. She moved efficiently through the shelves, gathering supplies without asking questions. Ethan appreciated that. When she returned, she handed him a small bottle and said, "Warm it, a little at a time. You feed him too fast, you'll lose him." Her tone was practical, but not cold, the way a medic talks to a soldier. He nodded once, meeting her gaze briefly. "Thanks." As he turned to leave, Sarah added, "Storm like that last week? You're lucky you made it back up there." Ethan's hand paused on the door. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said simply, then stepped outside. By the time he returned to the cabin, the light was fading. He lit the fire again, the smell of new wood filling the air. Scout wobbled on the floor, sniffing around his boots. Ethan unpacked the supplies, prepared a bowl, and watched the small dog eat with a hunger that was almost human. He leaned against the table, arms folded, and realized that the silence didn't press against him as it used to. It just existed, soft and bearable. Later that night, he sat in his chair with a worn notebook in his lap, one he hadn't opened since the day Shadow died. The pages were nearly empty except for a few numbers and faded words. He flipped to a new page and wrote slowly, "Day 6. Scout's alive. So am I." He stared at the words for a long time before closing the cover. The puppy slept across his boots, paws twitching in a dream. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, gentle, almost like forgiveness. Inside, warmth spread not just from the fire, but from something invisible, something earned. Ethan didn't know it yet, but this fragile peace would not last forever. Still, for that night, it was enough. The world outside could freeze all it wanted. Inside the cabin, 2 survivors had found their way back to life. Spring came quietly to the mountains. The snow that had once buried the cabin melted into small streams that whispered through the pines, feeding the first green shoots of grass. The air, once sharp and dry, now carried the scent of thawing earth and pine sap. Ethan Cole stood outside his cabin, axe resting on his shoulder, watching Scout bound through the melting snowbanks. The puppy had grown fast over the past weeks, his once bony frame now firm with muscle, his coat thick and gleaming with shades of bronze and sable. His ears stood tall and proud, his eyes bright amber with curiosity and loyalty. Every morning he followed Ethan's every step, whether chopping wood, hauling water, or hunting for rabbits along the ridge. The bond between them had become unspoken, but absolute. Ethan didn't need to raise his voice. A glance or gesture was enough. "Stay," he'd command softly, and Scout froze like a statue. "Heel." The dog moved beside him with soldier's precision. "Focus." The word once meant survival on the battlefield. Now it was the heartbeat of this quiet partnership. Scout wasn't Shadow, and Ethan didn't want him to be. Yet each time the dog responded to a command, something familiar and bittersweet stirred in him, a memory of sand, sun, and the weight of another life. The mountains had begun to soften, but inside Ethan, the winter had not yet melted. Night still carried the ghosts of the desert. He woke sweating, breathing hard, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting a blast. He tried to bury those memories under work, chopping, repairing, feeding. But they were always waiting, silent and patient as frost. One afternoon, Ethan took Scout deeper into the forest to gather wood. The path wound through tall birch trees, their bark peeling in thin white curls. The ground was damp with melting snow, the sunlight slanting gold through the branches. Scout moved ahead, tail flicking, nose pressed to the earth. Occasionally, he'd look back, checking that Ethan was still behind. The man smiled faintly. It had been years since someone had looked back to make sure he was there. They reached the edge of a small clearing where a half-frozen stream trickled between the rocks. Ethan set down his axe and crouched, washing his hands in the icy water. The world was peaceful until the shot came. It cracked through the air, sharp and close, tearing the quiet apart. Instinct exploded through Ethan's body before reason could stop it. His heart slammed into his ribs, his muscles seized. The forest around him blurred. In a flash, the memory of gunfire in Helmand replaced the birches, the sting of sand, the deafening roar, shadows bark, then silence. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head. No, not again. Scout barked, startled, circling him. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged bursts. His mind wasn't in Colorado anymore. He was crawling through dust, calling a name that would never answer. "Shadow! Stay back!" he shouted hoarsely. His body trembled, sweat chilling against his skin despite the mild air. Scout whined, pressing his head against Ethan's arm, but the man recoiled as though burned. "Go!" he shouted suddenly, voice breaking. "Get out! Leave!" The words tore out of him, desperate, unthinking, the same words he'd screamed the day Shadow died. Scout froze. For a moment his eyes flicked between confusion and hurt, then he took a hesitant step back. Ethan turned away, fists clenched, breath shallow. He stayed there until the echoes of the gunshot faded into silence and only the wind moved through the trees. When he finally looked up, the dog was gone. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than any march he'd done in the desert. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the sigh of wind, felt hollow. By the time he reached the porch, the sun had dipped low, painting the snow in shades of copper and rose. The cabin door closed behind him with a heavy thud. He sat in the chair beside the dying fire, staring into the embers, unable to shake the image of Scout's eyes as he turned away. Rain began sometime after midnight, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the tin roof. Ethan tried to ignore it, but each drop felt like a tap on his conscience. He rose once, opened the door, and peered into the dark. Nothing but rain and pine shadows. "He'll find shelter," he told himself, though the words rang empty. He threw another log on the fire, sat back down, and pressed his palms against his eyes. His chest ached. He hadn't realized how much silence could hurt until that night. But Scout had not gone far. Outside, beneath the sagging porch, the young German shepherd sat huddled in the rain. His fur clung to his body, dripping into puddles. The thunder startled him once, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if waiting for it to open. The cold seeped into his bones, but the memory of Ethan's voice, the voice that had saved him from death once, kept him anchored. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Mist clung to the forest, and water dripped from the eaves of the cabin. Inside, Ethan woke from a restless sleep, throat dry, mind fogged with guilt. The first light touched the window, revealing the blur of movement outside. He frowned, stood, and opened the door. Scout was there, soaked to the skin, shivering, but sitting upright. His fur hung heavy, eyes tired yet steady, fixed on Ethan with quiet resolve. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan knelt slowly, his voice rough. "You stayed." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the porch. Ethan reached out, hand trembling, and ran his fingers through the wet fur. "I didn't deserve that," he whispered. "Not after what I said." Scout leaned closer, pressing his head against Ethan's knee, as if forgiving him without needing to understand. The man swallowed hard, his throat burning. "You're a soldier," he murmured, "a better one than me." He lifted the dog in his arms, carried him inside, and wrapped him in a dry blanket. The fire crackled back to life, the smell of smoke filling the cabin. Scout curled up near the hearth, sighing deeply, and closed his eyes. Ethan sat beside him, hands clasped, watching the small chest rise and fall. Outside, the last of the rain slid down the window, tracing lines like cracks across the glass. Inside, another wall, one made of fear, guilt, and memory, began to fracture. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. The echo of the gunshot still lingered in his mind, but now it was softer, replaced by the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. When the sun rose fully, the cabin glowed with light. Scout stretched, shook himself dry, and padded toward the door, tail wagging as if nothing had happened. Ethan followed him outside, the grass damp beneath his boots, the mountains sharp and bright after the rain. For the first time, he didn't look toward the past, but toward the horizon, where the clouds had begun to break. He smiled faintly. "Come on, soldier," he said. "Let's start again." And as they walked together through the clearing, man and dog side by side, the world felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where life could begin again. Summer arrived gently in the high country, painting the forests in 1,000 shades of green. The streams ran faster, the air carried the scent of wet pine and warm earth, and sunlight poured through the trees like liquid gold. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude buried in snow, now stood surrounded by life, wildflowers, birds, and the faint hum of bees. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt his body grow stronger. His knee no longer locked with every step, and his breathing came easier. Each morning began with the sound of paws against the wooden floor and a deep bark that broke the silence of dawn. Scout, now nearly a year old, had grown into a magnificent German shepherd, tall, muscular, with a coat that shimmered between bronze and black. His eyes were bright amber, intelligent and alert, filled with fierce devotion. Ethan often found himself watching the dog the way a father watches a child, a mix of pride and awe. He had trained Scout with the same discipline he once gave his SEAL K-9 partners, using old commands burned into memory. "Stay, heel, focus," he'd say, his voice steady and low. Scout responded with uncanny precision, reading his every gesture, mirroring his calm. But unlike the military drills of old, these sessions were different. There was no violence, no explosions, no mission, only rhythm, trust, and the steady pulse of companionship. Every morning they ran the ridge together, Ethan's breath matching the sound of paws on dirt. The forest echoed with life, and for the first time he no longer looked over his shoulder expecting danger. The ghosts of war had quieted, though not entirely gone. Sometimes at night he still dreamed of the desert, the endless wind, the sand under his tongue, the sudden crack of gunfire. But when he woke, Scout would be there, his weight pressed close, a living reminder that the present was not a battlefield. One morning, as the sun filtered pale through the mist, Ethan split firewood near the path that led down toward the river. Sweat glistened along his temples, and the rhythmic sound of the axe filled the air. Scout lay a few yards away, watching him intently, tail flicking lazily. The forest was quiet, too quiet. A faint breeze carried a different scent, musky and sharp. Scout's ears pricked. He rose slowly, nose twitching, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Before Ethan could react, a low growl rolled through the clearing. From the shadows, a black bear emerged, lean, its fur dull, ribs showing beneath its hide. Hunger burned in its small dark eyes as it lifted its head and sniffed the air. The scent of food, smoked meat left cooling on the porch, had drawn it close. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. His rifle leaned against the cabin wall, just out of reach. The bear stepped forward, claws dragging through the soil. Scout's fur bristled, his stance shifting from calm to defensive. Then, with a bark that split the morning, he lunged forward, placing himself squarely between Ethan and the animal. The sudden sound startled the bear. It hesitated, huffing, standing on its hind legs to appear larger. Ethan's training kicked in, sharp, methodical. He reached slowly for the nearest weapon, a half-burned log still glowing with embers in the outdoor fire pit. He lifted it, the orange glow flickering in his eyes. "Back off," he said under his breath, his voice steady but low. The bear let out a guttural snarl, pacing sideways. Scout didn't retreat. He barked again, louder this time, his body rigid, teeth bared, tail raised. The bear roared and lunged forward a step, swiping the air with its claws. The movement was fast, a blur of fur and strength. Scout darted sideways, barking furiously, trying to draw the bear's attention away. Ethan took that instant, hurled the burning log toward the creature. The wood struck the ground near its feet, bursting into sparks. Flame and smoke erupted, the sudden noise startling the animal. The bear reared back, snarling, then stumbled as a spark caught its fur. With a frightened roar, it turned and bolted into the trees, crashing through branches until the forest swallowed it. For a moment, the clearing was still. Ethan stood, chest heaving, the smell of smoke and sweat thick in the air. Then he saw Scout limping toward him, one paw held awkwardly off the ground. A streak of red stained the fur along his leg. "Hey," Ethan said softly, dropping to his knees. "Hey, easy." He examined the cut, shallow but bleeding. The dog's sides rose and fell quickly, adrenaline still pumping. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, pressing his forehead against the animal's neck. "No one gets left behind, you hear me?" he whispered. "Not this time." They stayed like that for a while, man and dog, the heat of the fire dying beside them. When Scout finally relaxed, Ethan carried him inside, cleaned the wound carefully with warm water, and wrapped it in an old bandage. The pup's eyes never left his face, as if making sure his human wasn't hurt. Ethan smiled faintly, his hand still shaking from the rush. "You're supposed to let me handle the bears," he muttered. "Guess you missed that memo." Scout wagged his tail weakly, ears twitching. Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, Ethan sat on the porch, Scout resting beside him. The forest had returned to its quiet rhythm, crickets, wind, and the distant rush of the river. The encounter still echoed in Ethan's mind, not as fear, but as something else, a memory transformed. Years ago, the sound of danger would have paralyzed him. This time, he had stood his ground. The shaking in his hands wasn't panic anymore. It was life reminding him he was still capable of protecting something, not just surviving. Scout stirred and pressed his head against Ethan's leg. The bandage was already dirty from his insistence on following his master everywhere, refusing to rest. "You're not letting me out of your sight now, huh?" Ethan said quietly. The dog looked up, ears perked, eyes gleaming in the orange light. "Yeah," he whispered, voice soft but certain. "Me neither." From that day, Scout never strayed far. He followed Ethan from the woods to the porch, always within reach. The man didn't mind. He found comfort in the presence beside him, the steady breath, the loyal gaze that had once faced down a bear without hesitation. And deep inside, something shifted, not all at once, but enough for Ethan to realize that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing your ground with someone who refused to let you fall. As the summer light dimmed and the forest settled into stillness, Ethan leaned back against the cabin wall, the old pain in his knee forgotten. Scout slept with his head across Ethan's boots, twitching lightly in his dreams. The moon rose over the ridge, silvering the clearing where the bear had stood. Ethan looked out at it and smiled, a rare, honest smile that reached his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man haunted by his past. He felt like a man who had finally begun to live again. Autumn returned to the mountains with quiet grace. The leaves burned gold and red across the slopes, drifting down like embers over the forest floor. The wind no longer bit with winter's cruelty. It carried warmth and the faint scent of pine needles and soil. The cabin, once a lonely refuge half buried in snow, now looked alive. Small wildflowers climbed around the porch steps, and patches of yellow daisies grew beside the path. Ethan Cole had planted them himself that summer, a quiet act that felt like rebellion against the silence that had ruled his life for years. Scout was fully recovered, stronger than ever. His coat gleamed in the morning sun, the deep brown and black shifting like shadowed copper. His muscles rippled beneath the fur when he ran, and his eyes, bright amber and endlessly alert, followed every movement of his owner. At almost a year and a half old, he was no longer the trembling pup rescued from the snow, but a soldier in his own right, disciplined, protective, yet gentle. He had become the rhythm of Ethan's days, the echo of boots on wooden floors, the heartbeat that matched his own. Life had taken on a simple order. Ethan woke with the sunrise, fed Scout, split firewood, and sometimes hiked down the slope to check the river traps or refill water. He no longer counted the hours or the scars of old wounds. The ache in his knee still lingered, but it no longer felt like punishment. When he caught his reflection in the cabin window, the face that stared back seemed older, yes, but no longer haunted, lined by peace rather than pain. As the air cooled and the first frost kissed the grass, Ethan began to notice small changes outside his control. Someone, perhaps one of the townsfolk, had been leaving things on his porch: a basket of bread, bundles of firewood, and once a folded blanket stitched with mountain patterns. At first he thought it was a delivery mistake, but it happened again, always quietly, always before dawn. He didn't investigate. A small part of him liked the mystery. Scout, however, seemed to know exactly who was responsible. Each time he caught the faintest human scent near the trail, his ears perked, tail wagging low with excitement. One late afternoon, when the sky hung low and amber with the coming dusk, Ethan was stacking logs near the shed when Scout suddenly barked. Not the sharp, defensive bark of warning, but the cheerful sound he reserved for friends. Ethan turned just in time to see a figure walking up the trail from the trees. The sunlight behind her framed her in gold. She was Grace Miller, a woman in her early 30s who lived 2 valleys over. Ethan had seen her once or twice in Aspen Ridge. Short conversations at the general store, nods exchanged in passing. She was tall and slender, with light brown hair that curled loosely around her shoulders, and eyes the color of lake water, clear, calm, and a little curious. Her clothes were simple. A flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, jeans tucked into worn boots, a wool scarf draped around her neck. Her face carried that soft strength found in people used to mountain life, a quiet mix of kindness and endurance. "Didn't mean to startle you," Grace said, smiling gently. Her voice was warm, carrying a faint southern lilt that softened the words. She held a small wicker basket in her arms. "Scout gave me away before I could knock." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, unsure how to respond. "He doesn't usually bark for strangers," he said finally. Grace laughed, a light, unhurried sound. "Guess I've been leaving too many treats out here for him not to remember me." She lifted the basket slightly. "I figured I'd stop pretending it was a secret. Brought some bread and apples. The orchard's been good this year." For a long moment, Ethan just looked at her. The way the fading light touched her hair, the calm in her posture, the way she seemed to belong here as naturally as the trees. Then he nodded, stepping aside. "You came all this way. You should at least have some coffee." She hesitated, then smiled. "That sounds nice." Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse, the simplicity of a soldier's life. The smell of pine resin and fresh coffee soon filled the air. Grace sat near the window, her eyes drifting over the small details. The flag above the mantel, the scarred table, the neatly stacked firewood. "You've done well here," she said softly. "Most people can't stand being this far from the world." "Most people don't have much to come back to," Ethan replied. The words came out before he could stop them. For a second, silence stretched between them, but Grace didn't look away. "You came back," she said gently. "That's what matters." Scout settled near her feet, his head resting on her boot as if he'd known her forever. She leaned down to scratch behind his ears. "He's a good boy," she murmured. "You can tell by his eyes." "Saved my life more times than I can count," Ethan said, his voice quiet but warm. "Sometimes I think he saved me from myself." Outside, the light dimmed, turning the trees into silhouettes against the fading gold. They spoke of small things then, the changing weather, the town, her orchard, his garden of daisies. And for once, Ethan didn't measure every word. He found himself laughing once, softly, surprised at the sound. When Grace finally stood to leave, he walked her to the porch. The air had turned crisp, and the sky above the ridge burned in hues of rose and fire. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, pulling her scarf tighter. "Thank you for everything else," Ethan replied. She smiled. "You're welcome, Ethan." After she left, the cabin felt different, not emptier, but somehow warmer, like the echo of her presence still lingered in the air. Scout curled up beside him as he sat on the porch steps. The world was quiet again, but no longer lonely. The last of the lights slid across the clearing, painting everything in orange. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the old dog tag, scratched and dulled from years of wear. The letters Cole, Seal K9, caught the dying sun. He turned it over once in his fingers, then looked down at Scout. "Come here," he whispered. The dog lifted his head, patting closer. Ethan slipped the chain around Scout's neck, resting the tag against his fur. "You earned this more than I ever did," he said softly. "You didn't just pull me out of the storm, you showed me how to live again." Scout leaned against his leg, eyes half closed in quiet trust. Ethan looked out at the horizon, the sun sinking behind the peaks, the forest fading into shadow, and somewhere beyond, the faint glimmer of stars. His hand stopped trembling. The air felt steady in his lungs. He sat there for a long time, the old pain dissolving into the sound of wind through the pines. For the first time, peace didn't feel like a distant country. It was here, in the quiet rhythm of breathing, in the heartbeat beneath his hand, in the fading light that touched everything around him. The mountains would keep their storms. The world would go on with its noise. But inside that small cabin, in the company of one loyal dog and the memory of kindness, a soldier who had forgotten how to live finally found the light again. In the quiet heart of this story lies a truth we all need to remember. Healing doesn't always come from grand victories or perfect endings. Sometimes it begins with something small, a loyal friend, a kind gesture, or the courage to let light back into a broken heart. Ethan found his way back to life not through war or strength, but through compassion, trust, and the love of a creature who asked for nothing in return. In our everyday lives, we all carry invisible battles. Some days the world feels cold, the weight too heavy, and hope too far. But like Ethan, we can learn that peace is not the absence of pain. It's choosing to keep moving, to love again, and to open the door when someone, or something, is waiting on the other side. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little light today. Tell us in the comments what part spoke to you most and where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join us for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances. Together, let's keep spreading hope, one story at a time.